And we're live here on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. What's up, guys? Nick Scripp on the P2W Fantasy Podcast, heading into week 11. As always, this podcast is partnered up with the Fantasy Points Media Group, which is a branch of fantasypoints.com. Go check out fantasypoints.com. It's a one-stop shop for everything in the world you are looking for when it comes to fantasy football. Use my promo code for a discount, P2W22. It's well worth it. I'm on there every single day, checking out advanced data. A lot of people like the articles. We have an awesome Fantasy Points subscriber Discord. There's endless options on that site. So P2W22. I just ran a contest for a Venmo. I said, what retired NBA player jersey am I rocking? So I'll show you the front here. Chicago, of course. And on the back, number 91, as I knock my whole desk around. Dennis Rodman, the birth year there. So just got that jersey. Of course, have to be rocking something Chicago per usual. But today we are talking player spotlights for week 11. I'm going to go through every single game, talk about one player at least from each of those teams, and talk about a lot of fantasy football outlooks here. So stick with me if you were tuning in. Should be a good show. Let's get it.
Play to win, no fear to give. I feel, but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Yeah, I play to win, I play to win. Oh, play to win, I play to win. Yeah, play to win, I play to win.
Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. And within this, the shared screen, we'll have all the games. And we'll go through each game, talk at least one player from each team when it comes to the fantasy world and what we want to look for. So first game on the slate, this is Thursday Night Football. We have the Titans versus the Packers. I want to outline here Treylon Burks. He returned from the IR versus Denver in week 10, 5.4 fantasy points. Still waiting on the big breakout game. It didn't happen, but he did just get back. It's encouraging to see him at 6 targets immediately. He only caught 3 of them, but we saw a flash of some upside with a 15-yard reception. Yet to see a big game, like I just said, but Tennessee invested a first-round draft pick in Treylon Burks. They departed with A.J. Brown, who's now an Eagle. So I feel like they want to emphasize him getting involved and his development. And how do you do that? Get him more and more involved each week that he's healthy, right? This wide receiver room for the Titans, including Robert Woods, has been awful this year. One of the least fantasy-friendly. A lot of us are hoping for a Burks, progression that might be a useful fantasy option come the fantasy playoffs. So looking at this game versus the Packers, not the easiest of matchups, but again, we want to see that bump in his role. On the flip side, Christian Watson, in all honesty, I have not been a big fan of Christian Watson as a prospect. I felt he was a bit overhyped due to the minimal receiving resume he had in college. On the flip side, you have to acknowledge the opportunity he has the year that Devonta Adams is not on the Packers anymore. Unfortunately, he's been banged up off and on, but week 10 rolls around and Watson catches 4 of his 8 targets, and he takes 3 of those 4 catches for touchdowns. I won't lie, it was cold seeing him count the touchdowns on his fingers after he scored that third one. 107 receiving yards. Maybe he is not the most polished of wide receivers, or maybe he doesn't have the most elite skill set right now, but the athleticism plus Aaron Rodgers targets could turn into these big splash plays that we did see in week 10. On a side note, Tennessee gives up the 4th most points per game in fantasy to wide receivers on the year. So that sets up Christian Watson nicely in this coming week right after he had that massive game. So 2 young guys, 2 rookies. We want a spotlight for that one. Shift over to Chicago, my Bears versus the Falcons. Atlanta is a top 12 matchup in points per game allowed to all of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. You are starting Justin Fields if you roster him. In all honesty, I think if I have Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts, I'm not even looking at their matchups right now. If I have those guys, those might be the only guys that I'd be thinking about starting over Justin Fields after seeing what he's been doing the last couple of weeks. I don't want to just focus on him, though. I've been talking about Fields enough, the Unreal Fantasy Takeoff. But, Now comes Chase Claypool and Darnell Mooney in this matchup, who I feel like have the potential to have a good flex-worthy game. Atlanta gives up the most points per game to wide receivers on the year and the most passing yards per game. Mooney comes to mind. He just had 17.5 fantasy points in week 9. Can we see our first Chase Claypool good game, though? That's what I will be looking for in this matchup. A lot, to me, lines up for him to have a good week. The Bears went and sent a second-round pick for Claypool. Many spoke that they overpaid. The bottom line is that they did pay. So they went out and invested in this guy. So you have to believe that there's a plan to utilize him a bit more. Week 9, in his first game, he saw 6 targets. He only caught 2 of them. Pretty sure he might have had a drop or 2 in that one. Last week, though, only 2 targets, so not ideal. To me, though, Atlanta is the best matchup for wide receivers and would be the perfect time to get Chase Claypool rolling in his new offense. And we know that he does have that big play and touchdown upside. For Atlanta, no Atlanta running back scored 4 points in week 10. 3 guys were in the 3-point range. Algier had 11 touches, Patterson 6, Caleb Huntley at 5. Algier had 10% more of the snaps at 48% versus Patterson. After returning from the IR, Patterson had 2 rushing touchdowns and 18.3 fantasy points in week 9. I talk about it every week how bad Chicago is against running backs. I typically will list what every guy's done against Chicago. It's my Bears, it's my hometown team, so I am willing to admit this. I won't go in and bore you with those stats. I feel like I say it every week on the podcast, but they give up the 5th most points per game to running backs for fantasy on the year. Maybe there's this forced revenge game narrative for Cordero Patterson, who played in Chicago for both the 2019 and 2020 seasons. I have a feeling this is a good bounce back for him after he had a poor week last week. The Falcons are going to try to narrow that gap between the Bucs and them in the NFC North. They were once tied with them, so they do want to get that dub. And I feel like Patterson, getting him on track after seeing the good fantasy weeks, I think he's geared up to have another good one versus Chicago. Next, we have the Eagles versus the Colts. So big blow to Philadelphia, losing Dallas Goedert. A.J. Brown rolled his ankle last game, but I think he should be fine in this one. Philly will obviously be looking for a bounce back after the undefeated streak was killed off. The Colts are not as friendly through the air as they are on the ground in terms of fantasy points per game given up. They also, on offense, have generated the 3rd least points per game. So to me, this is emphasizing the Eagles' run game. All right, you got a team that's not super friendly for their defense through the air, but on the flip side, they're not generating a ton of points. So it's not like this is going to be this big air it out sort of shootout game. So this makes me think of Miles Sanders. He had a down fantasy week in week 10, 12 total touches for Miles in this one. On the season, he's top 10 in rushing yards. He's averaging 78.9 yards on the ground per game. After not scoring a touchdown in 2021, he has 6 on the year total. 26 red zone opportunities is top 10 for running backs, and that's giving him a good push towards more touchdowns. 13.6 fantasy points per game, 4 games of 17-plus carries. I like Miles Sanders to see some good volume and get back on fantasy track against the Colts in Week 11. The other guy I want to mention versus the Eagles for the Colts, Matt Ryan was out of the mix for 2 weeks, and right before he was benched for Sam Ehlinger, Paris Campbell had these 2 games of like 18-ish fantasy points. Then he sloped downwards, and then this past week had another really good game. So Paris Campbell's probably a guy that fell off of your radar just because, again, 2 pretty poor games with Sam Ehlinger where, you couldn't play him in those 2 games, but seeing the last 3 games with Matt Ryan, maybe, the Eagles are a tough matchup. Maybe it's not the best matchup to put him in your lineup, but I feel like he should be at least rostered right now. And if I go and check the roster percentages, I'm sure he's still under 50% on Sleeper and ESPN, which I usually note. So Paris Campbell, again, tough matchup, but again, in the last 3 games he's played with Matt Ryan, he's been good. So make sure that he's actually rostered. Shifting over to the Jets versus the Patriots. This will be the second time these guys played each other this year. Patriots are not super giving to either running backs or wide receivers for fantasy points per game, 31st and 29th, given up to those two positions. Surprisingly, though, and maybe this is driven by some outliers, but they give up the sixth most points per game to the tight end position. So is this a sneaky Tyler Conklin game? That's my big question. So Tyler Conklin, the targets fluctuate in waves, it feels like. Weeks 5 and 6, he combined for 3 targets. But week 7 and 8, he combined for 16 targets. Last week, just 2. So risky in the fantasy world, just seeing him not be super consistent in terms of the volume he's getting from Zach Wilson. He did open up the season, targeted 7+ times for 3 weeks. He's had some solid fantasy weeks this year in general. He just had a 25-point outing against the Patriots when they played each other. And that's who they play this week. 6 catches on 10 targets for 79 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns, 25 points, week 8 versus the Patriots. So my thing is, I know it's been a bit inconsistent. I know that the Patriots are a tougher defense, even though, like I noted, they are actually not great versus the tight end position for fantasy. If it worked before for the Jets, why not get Tyler Conklin right back involved against the Patriots, who we had a great game against last time they played recently? I think we have this mindset on the flip side that the Jets are not a great organization and it's a fantasy-friendly matchup for different positions in terms of points per game given up to running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. But they are outside the top 15 for all of those positions. I have to mention, though, the Patriots knew some sort of morphed version of James White and Derrick Henry, this hybrid of Ramondre Stevenson. 8, 7, and 7 targets the last 3 games. This provides a safer floor in fantasy getting that sort of receiving work. He had 72 receiving yards on top of 71 rushing yards in week 8. And that was against the Jets, who they play again. He finished with 21.3 fantasy points that game. So again, similar to Conklin, last time they had a matchup, this guy did good. Maybe the paper says certain things about the defenses, but again, if it worked before, why not go right back to what did work in this specific matchup? Next on the list, we will go to the Commanders versus the Texans. Not gonna lie, it's pretty badass seeing Tyler Heineke on the plane wearing a bunch of chains, sipping Busch Lights, and his teammates hyping him up, man, after that win versus the Eagles. Straight out the gate, this game stands out for the 2 running backs, Antonio Gibson and Brian Robinson. J.D. McKissic, I think, might be back, but I'm not going to focus on him right now. This past week, Gibson had 17 touches on 48% of the snaps, 14.8 fantasy points. Brian Robinson, 26 touches on 52% of the snaps, 14.6 fantasy points. So both guys had a really nice week this past week. They both had plenty of touches. Gibson has been more efficient with his work for the fantasy world. Week 7 and 8, he had 13 and 14 touches and still scored over 16 fantasy points in both. 26 carries for Brian Robinson. That's not a joke. That's important to note. Houston is a tough matchup for wide receivers in the fantasy world, but believe it or not, the Texans are giving up the most points per game to running backs on the year and giving up the most rushing yards per game. 20 more rushing yards per game on average than any other team in the NFL. So to me, both guys are pretty good plays if you do roster either one of them. Other side of the ball, Nico Collins, he's been limited at practice, so be sure to monitor this. But it's a side note that Brandon Cooks did not practice on Wednesdays, so we are unsure if Cooks is even going to be a go, and you have to make sure, obviously, that Collins is as well. But finally had a bigger game this past week, 15.9 fantasy points. He led the team in targets with 10, which is huge. First touchdown of the year. He had a prospect profile that has shown us to be able to produce good numbers in the yards per catch department on the outside, which he's done a few times this season. If his targets can stay somewhere between 7 and 10, he becomes a weekly flex option. Washington gives up the 10th most points per game to wide receivers on the year. I feel like Nico Collins, if healthy and active, is a good flex play this week after he just had his best fantasy week last week. So go to the Rams versus the Saints. I'm sure there will be a lot of finger pointing to who will absorb the vacated Cooper Kupp targets now that he hit the IR. He had 98 in 9 games. It's a ton. Skowronek had 7 last game, but he caught 2 of them. Week 5, he had 8, and he was efficient catching 6, 16.7 fantasy points. Week 6, aided by a rushing touchdown. Van Jefferson has worked back into the mix following his knee surgery earlier this season that landed him on the IR. Scored a touchdown in Week 10, 8 targets across his last 2. Allen Robinson has averaged 5.2 targets per game on the year, 2 games of 15-plus fantasy points, 6 games under 9 fantasy points, though. The people who said Chicago was the reason that he regressed, I don't know. He hasn't looked great this year either, in all honesty. But he's going to be the guy that most people expect to take this giant leap forward. I'm going to focus on Tyler Higbee, though. Opened up the season heavily targeted, 11, 9, 4, 14, and 10 the first 5 weeks. Number 3 for tight ends in targets, receptions, and yards after the catch. Yet to score a touchdown, but I feel like if he gets his volume back, that should change. So I look at Higbee as a guy who had 3 games of 10-plus targets, and I think he can get that bump right back. Everybody else to me is a big question mark right now. Some people have noted Higbee doing a lot of blocking, but again, we've seen plenty of weeks this season. You can say he did, this amount of blocking for this percent of the time or ran this amount of routes. I'm just looking at the targets, man, at the end of the day. And if he's had plenty of weeks of good, solid targets for the tight end position. If he's top 3 in targets right now, that says a lot for the tight end landscape in the fantasy world. And I think he can get a bump to be back into that, tight end that is being consistently used in this offense. Because, again, these other guys are not super impressive on paper. But I will note that the Saints are the toughest matchup in points per game allowed to tight ends. So if he has a bad week, know that the matchup was horrible, but make sure to pay attention to the target numbers, I'd say, in this one. But if he does have a bad week, don't freak out. I actually think he's a good trade target right now. Other side of the ball for the Saints, got to talk about Chris Olave. He's coming off of his lowest fantasy point week of the season with only 7 fantasy points. He's been under 14 fantasy points now 3 straight games. Don't pivot away from Chris Olave. He is top 10 in targets. He's averaging 8.6 per game. Top 12 in receiving yards. He's averaging 73.1 per game. Opportunities are there for big splash plays. It's evident through the air yards and deep targets, in which he ranks number 2 in both of those categories for wide receivers. The Rams give up the 9th most points per game to wide receivers on the year. Great trade target before he has another good game, because again, he's been down, but the signs point in the direction of upside, and it's a great matchup this week against the Rams. Next on the list, we have the Browns versus the Bills. Jacoby Brissett is coming off of a game against Miami where he threw the ball 35 times, meaning they could not solely rely on Nick Chubb to win last week against Miami, right? Against Buffalo, you have to think they will have to throw the ball a decent amount again. Amari Cooper had a down game, but I expect him to have some better days ahead. But I want to talk about Donovan Peoples-Jones, who has been, I've been talking about him plenty. I just traded for him in a big dynasty league like 2 days ago. Really, really like the outlook of him. He had 14.9 fantasy points this past week. This marked his 4th consecutive week above 70 receiving yards and 5th across his last 6 total games. 9 targets versus Miami. He has yet to score a touchdown, but with that sort of receiving yard upside and wide receiver 2 role, that can come. It's a tough fantasy matchup all around, but I like him to be in your flex spot just because he's been consistent in the receiving yard department. Surprisingly, on the other side of the ball, the Browns give up the 2nd most points per game to the running back position. Devin Singletary is coming off of a solid week, 14.7, 2 rushing touchdowns. He had 14 total touches on 72% of the snaps, 4 straight appearances of 72+% of snaps. Nyheim Hines looks like he's just a special teams player right now. James Cook's not cutting in, enough to be worried about anything, but I don't think anybody expected him to do what he did at the end of 2021, where he was like scoring 16 to 20 fantasy points in a big stretch of games. But I feel like Devin Singletary's been a pretty decent play in, specific weeks this season. And, we deal with a fantasy world where we have guys in committees that we don't want them to be. We deal with a fantasy world where we got, guys like Javonte Williams, Brees Hall that have season-ending injuries. We have bye weeks. We have underperformers. Look at Najee Harris. So Devin Singletary, it's a good matchup. I feel like he's a good play again this week. Shifting over to the Panthers versus the Ravens. I want to talk about Deonta Foreman. Guy had 31 total touches last week, which was second to all running backs. Saquon Barkley had, I think, 36. 130 rushing yards in this one after a bad week 9, but 118 rushing yards, both 7 and 8 for those 2 weeks. At least 16 fantasy points in 3 out of 4 of his last games played. I listed Foreman as a must-start running back, and I got some shit for it because people were saying, well, it depends on the matchup. If they're going to chase the game, then maybe he's not a good play. Sure. Which we can only predict the games that people are going to chase at the end of the day. I mean, sometimes it seems pretty obvious, but other times maybe it's harder to talk about. But the matchups are a factor. I will say that. But a guy hitting these 100-yard rushing days and seeing high workloads, I feel like if you don't play him, then trade him. If you have a guy like him and you're only playing him for very specific matchups, then trade Deonta Foreman. Otherwise, I just mentioned you got guys who have been banged up and injured and in committees and not performing well, and there's bye weeks. I feel like a guy that gets that sort of workload this past week, he's going to get touches on the ball, man. He's been performing well for them. So against the Ravens, I feel like he should crack your lineup. And if he doesn't, you're either loaded at running back and hoarding, or 2, you're not capitalizing on finding and identifying managers in your league that need a running back desperately and capitalizing on that. The Panthers give up the 6th most points per game to the running back position. On the other side of the ball, Gus Edwards did return to practice. Could be messy if he plays because then we're not sure, what his exact limitations are. If Gus does not suit up, though, play Kenyon Drake. 26 total touches last game he played. 68% of the snaps versus the Saints. He scored 2 touchdowns and finished with 24.9 fantasy points. If Gus plays, who knows, who's going to get what. I'm not super comfortable with playing either of those guys if Gus Edwards does roll out in this game. But if they sit Gus Edwards another week, again, the Panthers, 6th most points per game to running backs. Kenyon Drake had like workhorse numbers last time he played. I think Kenyon Drake would be a good play in a world that Gus Edwards does not play. Lions versus the Giants. So my eye is going to be, of course, on my guy DeAndre Swift. What is his usage going to be like? If you listen to this show, you know I'm a massive truther. He now is heading into his 4th game following the return from injury. Here's how the 3 games went after he's come back. 55% of the snaps to 16% to 31%. 10 to 5 to 7 touches. While he is shown to be productive on minimal touches, he scored 2 touchdowns through these 3 games. It's hard to trust him, but we have to hope we start seeing a shift in use versus the Jamal Williams show. Justin Jackson was also involved last week, the 3rd running back involved. Swift has also voiced his frustration with his use. Could this be the week he gets like 12 to 15 touches? We'll have to see. I kind of get the hesitation to force him into work, knowing that they're not winning games. The Lions are 3-6 right now. They're not a competitor or anything like that. But again, he's eager to play. He's played now 3 games since returning from injury. In this 4th game, can he get a better workload? The Lions defense are the 7th best matchup in points per game wide receivers for fantasy. I've talked a lot about Wan'Dale Robinson in my hopes that he becomes the number 1 target on this offense in the slot. But I want to talk about Darius Slayton and what he's done. From weeks 5 through 10, week 9 was a bye. He's had weeks of 13.9, 14.8, 11.6, 18.5 fantasy points. So flex-worthy plays during those specific weeks, especially if you had somebody on a bye or dealing with injuries or don't have wide receiver depth, which some teams don't. 58, 66, and 95 receiving yards across the last 3 games with 2 touchdowns added. The targets are not phenomenal, but he's a big play threat versus the Lions, giving up the 6th most passing yards per game on the year. So deeper leagues, take a look at Darius Slayton. All right, we got the Raiders versus the Broncos now. So the Broncos are a tough matchup to quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends for fantasy points per game. They are the most friendly in comparison to those two tight ends. Foster Moreau is the starting tight end, rostered in 41% of sleeper leagues in place of Darren Waller on IR. 13.3 fantasy points this past week, guided by a touchdown. He's had back-to-back weeks of like 42, 43 receiving yards. Hunter Renfrow, we know, is out of the mix on IR as well. Devontae Adams, I think, is dealing with something with his ab right now. I don't know how serious that is, but he could be a nice streamer this week against the Broncos. Other side, Jerry Jeudy is sidelined Wednesday with that ankle injury. His status is in question for this week. Is it time again for a Sutton good game? The last time Sutton has scored over 15 fantasy points was week 4. Weeks 5 through 10, he scored 12-ish twice, but then he's had under 6 fantasy points 3 times. A lot of people were super spicy with their Sutton takes coming into the season. I'm sure that, some of that has to do with Russell Wilson, but he's been underwhelming in all honesty. Great fantasy quarterback matchup against Las Vegas, giving up the second most points per game to quarterbacks. The Raiders give up the 12th most points per game to wide receivers. So coming off of an 11-target week and taking 6 of those for 66 yards, it could certainly be the Sutton bounce-back game, especially if Jeudy is out of the mix. Next game, we have the Cowboys versus the Vikings. Last week on the P2W Fantasy Podcast, this podcast, I listed Dalton Schultz as a trade target. 65% and then 71% of the snaps played week 7 and 8 before the bye after missing week 6. 5 to 7 targets, 49 to 74 receiving yards across those 2 games. We know Schultz, what he did last season. Had over 100 targets, ran the 5th most routes for tight ends, had the 3rd most receptions and 6th most receiving yards with over 800, 8 touchdowns. So the reason I listed him as a trade target is because I read off to what he was doing week 7 and 8. Everything was trending in the right direction. The snaps were increasing, the receiving yards were increasing, the fantasy points were increasing. You have to take those signs and jump on them. I feel like he's a top 5 to 7 tight end rest of season. He had a season high 13.9 fantasy points in week 8. And then in week 9, he topped it with 17.4. In a game, he caught 6 passes for 84. I got those weeks mixed up. Season high 13.9 week 8 there. But the last game he played 17.4 fantasy points for Dalton Schultz. So again, you looked at the trends for Dalton Schultz and he said, hey, everything is trending in the right direction. That's kind of when you need to have that timing. So week 9 was the bye. That's what threw me off there. But week 10, again, 17.4 fantasy points after he had that 13.9 outing in week 8, right before their bye. He caught 6 passes for 54 yards and a touchdown. Everything's trending up for Dalton Schultz. And Minnesota is giving up the 9th most points per game to the tight end position. He 100% should be in your lineups. It's crazy. I picked him up off of waivers, I think, 2 weeks ago in a keeper league. The Cowboys are a tougher matchup in general. Might as well talk about the other tight end in this matchup, TJ Hawkinson. He's been the second option since joining the Vikings for Kirk Cousins. 19 targets across his last 2 games played, 70 and 45 receiving yards. We've seen these spells with Kirk Cousins for the Vikings the last 2 seasons with Irv Smith when he's actually healthy and Tyler Conklin in recent times. But I feel like Kirk definitely has found his true tight end. You have to think that this is a bump in TJ Hawkinson's dynasty value, just seeing his role. So I just want to see in this matchup, 19 targets across the last 2 games. Can it stay at that sort of level? Because if it does, we're getting glimpses of, I'm not comparing him to them, but glimpses of Kelsey and Mark Andrews volume. Next matchup, always a fun matchup, historically, maybe on paper, but the Bengals versus the Steelers. So the Steelers are the second best matchup for wide receivers in fantasy points per game given up on the year. Chase is looking like he's getting close to return. We view T. Higgins in his absence as the alpha, but let's look at Tyler Boyd. 13.1 points per game on the season for the fantasy world, running the second most snaps from the slot, number 22 in receiving yards for wide receivers with 59.7 per game, number 26 in yards after the catch, 4 touchdowns on the year, which is on pace to beat his career record, single season touchdown scored. Number 7 in yards per target for the wide receiver position. So I'm listing a bunch of good things here because he's had 12.8 and 9.4 fantasy points the last 2 games. Nothing super sexy, right? He has scored twice this season, though, over 20 fantasy points. I feel like this is a bounce back game for Boyd to where if you bench him, you're going to kick yourself in the ass and say, man, why did I not just flex him? It was a good matchup again against the Steelers, giving up the second most points per game to wide receivers in fantasy on the year. Other side of the ball, George Pickens, 14.5 fantasy points last week. Not necessarily the upstick in targets we thought we'd see with only 4, but he carried the ball twice and he scored on a carry. There has been signs for big plays and the ability to make big plays this season for the rookie. It's through his air yards and his deep targets. He's number 23 for wide receivers in air yards and number 11 in deep targets with 14. He's had games of 102, 83, and 61 receiving yards. So the hope here is that with Chase Claypool out of the mix, who was second in targets on the Steelers before he was shipped off to Chicago, the hope is that we get more consistent targets out of George Pickens just because, again, he has the ability to make these big plays, and we've seen him make some big plays this year. But now if you give him more opportunities to do so, that's going to trickle down to the fantasy world and be great there. So 4 games of 14-plus points this season. George Pickens is a guy I feel like it could be a good upside play the rest of the fantasy season. All right, so last game we'll actually discuss here, the Chiefs versus the Chargers. So I have an interesting Justin Herbert set of stats here. So Justin Herbert has a passer rating. This is via StatMuse. Has a passer rating of 106.3 with 1,464 yards, 13 touchdowns, 3 interceptions in 5 games against the Chiefs in his career. So if we look at the averages here, pretty small on my screen, 292.8 passing yards per game, 2.6 passing touchdowns per game. Pretty good marks, right? Pretty good marks. Maybe it's what brings out the best in Justin Herbert is these Kansas City Chiefs matchups. And the Kansas City Chiefs allow the 4th most points per game to quarterbacks. Herbert is coming off of 2 games of like 12, 13 fantasy points in a row. So not great. He hasn't had the best fantasy season, just in all honesty. But the last time he faced the Kansas City Chiefs, he scored 24.46 fantasy points. That was week 2. There's a chance Keenan Allen is back this week. So we're going to be looking to see if his veteran wide receiver, that's his true number 1 target, is actually going to be back in this. But it's a good matchup. He's done well against the Chiefs in the past, and I feel like it's a good bounce back week for Justin Herbert. Other side of the ball, the Chargers give up the 3rd most points per game to the running back position. So let's talk about the running backs this past week. Jerick McKinnon led the way in fantasy points, only 11.8, but he had 7 touches, 38% of the snaps. I believe he had 6 catches in this one, which is good for PPR leagues. Isaiah Pacheco, 16 touches in the game, 56% of the snaps. Not a good fantasy week, though, 5.2 points, but that's good signs for him getting some good work. CEH only saw 4 snaps. Apparently, the Chiefs went out and bid on Eno Benjamin and try to get him, so that makes CEH and his stocks look even worse. Isaiah Pacheco should lead in carries in this one. McKinnon could be involved in the passing game at a decent rate, so I feel like these guys can be good plays depending on the size of your leagues, right? If you want a guy who's probably going to touch the ball the most, it should be Pacheco in this one. If you are in a deeper league, PPR league, I think McKinnon's actually a pretty good play just because, again, of the involvement in the passing game. 6 receptions last game. Now they play the Chargers, and again, it's a good fantasy-friendly matchup to running backs. So that is a game that both of those guys will be interesting to take a look at, again, depending on your league size and what other running backs you do have to roster. But Chiefs, Chargers, always a fun game. I'm hoping that the Chargers are a little bit more healthy in this one. 49ers play the Cardinals on Monday night. I'll probably drop something Monday morning regarding that matchup. So we'll cut this podcast here. But thank you guys for tuning in. You can find me at P2W Fantasy on Twitter, TikTok. I run the Fantasy Points page there. But just plugging away, dropping a shit ton of content every single day. Feel free to shoot me, if you're seeing this on like Facebook, a text or a message on Facebook, or you can comment on YouTube. You can comment on Twitter, send me a DM. You can at me your questions, always here with the intent to help you guys play to win. Let's get it. Week 11. We need to make those playoff pushes, and good luck to you guys.